Palworld's latest patch made secret changes that you're definitely gonna need to know before breeding, and they nerfed gold farming, buffed base pal priorities and movements, and on top of all that, they made a bunch of hidden changes that we'll cover as we go through the changes today. Now, speaking of changes, I'd really appreciate if you could change the like button to be clicked. That would be amazing. And without further ado, we'll begin with the first hidden change. So this was not in the patch notes and seemingly was unintentional. I don't think the devs actually wanted to do this because for a long time, there's been a huge bug in the game that I've talked about in some of my other Palworld content that allows players to exploit capture rates, okay? So the way the bug works is that you could aggro the cops and then bring them into a syndicate tower and have them shoot the tower boss. If you did that, you'd then be able to capture the boss 100% of the time. It was a guaranteed capture. But weirdly, in this patch, they removed that bug, which doesn't sound that weird because it's a patch. You expect them to fix bugs. But then the devs came out and revealed this was unintended and it only happened because of other bug fixes. So maybe they'll bring the bug back in the future? I guess we'll have to wait and see, but there are some other major fixes in the patch that are very much intentional. So for example, they've now got fully supported keyboard key configuration. So some things that couldn't be rebound previously now can be. So for example, you can change the interaction 2 keybind, which controls picking up and throwing pals, and there's a bunch of others as well. They've added a thing where if you want to jump back a few days in your world for some reason, maybe the apocalypse started and you just weren't feeling it, you can now load a backup of your save data in the menu just here. Really nice little quality of life change. And speaking of, actually, they've also resolved an issue where unnecessary data would accumulate in your save data. But I'm gonna be real with you guys, I've got no freaking idea what that means. So leave your best guesses in the comments down below. And it also looks like the devs have been inspired by Helldivers 2. So in Helldivers, there have been a bunch of issues where people would log in and they'd get past that login queue, but then they would just AFK in the game because they didn't want to have to get the login queue again. And that would mean that other people couldn't play. And so the Helldivers team basically added a thing that kicked AFK players. And there's a similar thing that's been added here in Palworld. So previously, guilds have had player caps, right? So you couldn't rotate new players into the guild if old members stopped playing. Exactly the same kind of vibe as the Helldivers thing. But now you can kick those members if they're offline. So you can free up new spaces in your guild player cap and therefore make sure that everyone is pulling their weight and it's only full of current players, which is a really good change as well because Palworld's actually lost something like 90% of its player base since launch. Now, another quality of life change comes from if you go to options, game settings, and change hold to toggle interaction to on. And you'll then be able to press a button once and it's going to continue crafting, which is lovely, but a little heads up here, you will have to interact again after one item finishes crafting. So this is a good change for building, but doesn't help much for crafting large stacks of items, for example. Now, on top of that, the game now lets you interact with objects in front of you more accurately, so you'll be less likely to misclick or misselect things. Now, I mentioned at the start that there are some breeding changes, right? Especially ones that mean you should stop hatching your eggs now. And we're going to get to that, but first I want to cover some of the changes to pals themselves. So previously, pals set to attack aggressively used to just stand around and wait for you to enter combat before attacking. But now if you set to attack aggressively, they're going to attack whoever is in sight every time, so they're just a little bit more independent. But this could actually cause you some problems. So for example, if you're a low level and you're walking around alpha pals like this high level Mamarest, you're going to want to make sure that your pals are set to passive, or else you could get yourself into a spot of bother. Another pal change affects the condenser. So basically, before, every pal sacrificed in the condenser used to be treated as the same value towards upgrading another pal. But now, pals that have been upgraded via the condenser, so level 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, now have a higher value when used to condense into other pals. Now, a warning for this, okay, is that before you try condensing, you can't simply take a level 4 pal, right, and condense it to make another pal level 4. It doesn't work that way. Instead, you basically have diminishing returns. So it takes 117 pals to upgrade a pal to level 4, but a level 4 pal will only contribute a value of 65 when being used in the condenser. So it's not just like a one-to-one linear swap here. However, it costs 5 pals to create a level 1 pal, and a level 1 pal will contribute a value of 5 when condensed. So you are totally fine to combine your pals into level 1s via the condenser if you're running out of space in your pal box, and you won't lose out there. It's just at the higher levels, that's when the diminishing returns start to kick in. Now, speaking of leveling up your pals and stuff like that, it used to be that pals would learn active skills progressively as they leveled up, right? But if they hit max level from a huge XP gain, they wouldn't learn any of their active skills. And this has now been fixed, so you can power level those pals like crazy without there being consequences. And for our final pals point, before we move on to issues with bases, which are so good, the stuff that they've done there is fantastic, it's also worth mentioning that they've mitigated an issue when using Mosander's partner skill, Grenadier Panda, on a dungeon boss, because previously that would cause the boss to get stuck in the wall, but it doesn't do that anymore. So let's talk about some of these massive improvements to bases. Previously, pals would get stuck on basically everything, right? We've all been dealing with this for weeks now, and it's a pain in the butt. Or rather, I should say, it's a pain in the base, I guess. But this should now be fixed in most instances. They've really done a lot of work on pal pathing and stuff like that, especially for getting stuck on top of logging sites. And they've also added in new game logic to prevent the issue where base pals would wander around and get stuck at the border of the base. And that same logic is going to help issues that were present previously where pals at the base would get stuck repeatedly starting transportation tasks, and the light bulb icon would appear over and over again. So with all of this extra pal logic happening here, maybe pals will actually do the things that we ask them to do. Wouldn't that be crazy? And it goes further still. So they've added stuff to prevent the issue of base pals getting stuck in the farm on a roof. They're preventing pals from getting stuck in the summon space of pal boxes when restarting the server on a dedicated server. And they've also adjusted work priority, which is quite interesting. So something that they don't specifically mention in the patch notes, and they haven't kind of publicized, is that there's a change that actually affects all pals, which is that they now prioritize harvesting world resources before starting work at something like a stone pit. So if previously you've been worried about the placement of your stone farms, you can now place those freely at your mining bases and you'll be just fine. They've also relaxed building restrictions for stairs and triangular roofs, so you can place those more freely too. And they've changed something where a sound would play in an infinite loop when pals were at the base using certain active skills. Thankfully, that's gone now. Now, in some of my previous Palworld videos, I've done myth busting, for example, experimenting with the idea of putting campfires next to each other to see if I could warm up eggs by just stacking fires, right? And that video has a bunch of other myths in it as well. It's linked in the description and in the corner of the screen right now. But now they've changed it so that if you put 4 campfires next to each other, the surrounding area will have the temperature of a volcano. And so your eggs will be able to warm up, and you can incubate dragon eggs anywhere in the world. Now, interestingly, there's a hidden change associated with this as well. So now, when you throw down any fire pal from your party, your heat dial is going to go up. And so you're going to need max heat resistance to travel at the volcano while riding a Ragnarhawk, for example. So be careful. Like, those fire pals now have consequences, I guess. And this obviously affects sort of the balance of the game and what's meta and stuff like that a little bit. And we'll talk more about balance adjustments and stuff in a sec. But our final base change is that they've implemented a relaxed working style on the monitoring stand. So pal sanity will stay down while working at the base. And that sounds like a good option to have at face value, right? But another hidden change that was unintended, and it's going to be fixed in the next patch, is that if you have a monitoring stand that already exists before this patch went out, make sure you check its status, because a lot of the time it will default to relaxed with this update, and you might find that your pals are not getting as much done as you expect them to do unless you update it. Now then, balance. So they've significantly strengthened mining power for Digtoy's partner skills. So now throwing a Digtoys down will basically instantly break ores. They've sadly, maybe, fixed the abnormally high selling price of nails. So nails are no longer the best thing to sell. My suggestions for alternatives would be pizza. Pizza's really profitable, but it isn't worth making if you don't have insane production, I would say, because it uses flour and milk, and those can also be used for cake. So I'd say you could consider baked berries and salad. Those are easy to make large quantities of and sell for a decent amount of gold. And it is also a good idea to have a bunch of salad for reasons that I've talked about in some of my Palworld tips and tricks videos, linked on screen and in the description down below. But an alternative to that is it might even be better to have a few Sibilix placed in Ranch, because they give high quality cloth and that sells for around 40 gold per item. And an even better option on top of that might just be farming the Black Marketeer with a hanging trap and campfire. If you don't know how to do that, follow what I'm doing in the gameplay here. You basically just need to get him trapped and then place a campfire underneath him to burn him to death. Sounds crazy, but that's Palworld, baby. And you can do this at any level as well and just continue to farm him. Further balance changes include significantly increasing the number of police officers who appear when a crime is committed. And speaking of crime, we all know that there are 3 wildlife sanctuaries on the map, right? And they've got some of the best and rarest pals in the game, like a Grisbolt or a Yormantide Ignis, stuff like that. Now, previously, if you flew over those areas with a flying mount and you didn't get off, you wouldn't become wanted, even if you captured pals at the sanctuaries. But now, because crime doesn't pay, they've changed it so that the game is going to give you a wanted status now for invading those sanctuaries. Now, going back to some of the other balance changes, they've also added an electric shock effect to free Pal Alliance's crossbow. They've adjusted the flight distance of sphere launcher and scatter sphere launcher, so maybe they'll be actually useful to craft now. That would be nice. And they've increased the sand value recovery amount of high quality hot springs. So previously, the low level hot spring was just as effective. You could just use that, but now it's worth spending more materials to get the better version. Now, we've nearly reached our little egg hatching warning, but first, some things that you might notice just when you start logging into the game. They've renovated the server lobby, and search by server name now works. They've added the ability to view online players on a dedicated server. And our final 5 bullet points before we get onto the hidden breeding change is: number 1, they fixed the issue where day 5 memo was not placed. Number 2, you can now adjust the in-game brightness in the settings. Woohoo! Number 3, they've fixed a lot of minor bugs. Number 4, they've corrected various incorrect text that used to be present in the game. And number 5, they've improved measures against cheating. And you better believe we're still going to be trying to exploit this game as much as we can and posting more tips and tricks and myth busting and secrets and stuff like that, even with these changes made. So be sure to subscribe for those videos in the future, and we can talk about the breeding change, right? So as we all know, when you breed normally, what happens is you're basically funneling different traits from one pal over to another, and you are trying to curate the traits that the pal that you're breeding will end up having by carefully selecting its parents and stuff like that. And there have been stuff that I've talked about in my breeding tips videos with regards to, for example, not breeding with pals with 4 traits and just sticking with pals with 2 traits and all those sorts of things. But as it stands right now, there's actually an issue associated with hatching eggs specifically that is going to mess up all of that previous breeding knowledge. So currently, hatched pals are going to act as if they were wild caught, meaning you can no longer breed into perfect passives, and that just doesn't work anymore. And this is because they retain their passives. And the devs have commented on this, saying that this is not intended and this is an issue right now, but it means that you should save your eggs because every type of pal will always come with a fixed passive, good or bad, like Earth Emperor on an Anubis. So save those eggs, do not hatch them, and wait for that next patch if you can help it, in order to make sure that your breeding efforts are actually effective.